Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really diving headfirst into something I think a lot of you are feeling right now, that unsettling sense that democracy itself is under, well, enormous pressure.
Yeah, it's definitely palpable. It's not just a vague anxiety anymore, is it? Feels like a fundamental part of 21st century politics. Public trust seems to be eroding almost everywhere.
Exactly. And what we want to unpack today is this idea that liberal democracy is caught in what we're calling a pincer movement.
That's right. Think of it like a two-pronged attack. A synergistic assault, really, threatening its foundations.
Synergistic meaning they actually, feed off each other, make each other worse.
Precisely. These two forces magnify each other's destructive power. The whole becomes greater, or maybe I should say more damaging, than the sum of its parts.
Okay, so let's talk about these two forces, these two blades of the pincer. The first one is the horseshoe theory. It's often debated, this idea.
Very debated. It suggests the far left and the far right aren't polar opposites like we usually imagine. They actually curve back towards each other in some, well, surprising and pretty unsettling ways.
And the other blade.
That's the UniParty thesis. Now, this isn't just some French conspiracy theory, though it can sound like one sometimes. When you look at it through a political science lens, it points to a very real um, structural weakening, a hollowing out of mainstream political parties themselves.
Right. So our mission today is to unpack these two powerful forces. We want to show you how they work, maybe how they work together, why they're potentially so dangerous.
And ultimately, what it all means for, the future of how we're governed and maybe how you understand the political stuff dominating the headlines.
Yeah, because understanding this dual threat, this synergistic attack, it really does give you critical insight. It equips you to think more clearly about what's actually happening out there. So let's get into it. Let's start with that first blade then, the horseshoe theory. It's provocative because it just completely challenges the usual left-right line, doesn't it?
It really does. Instead of a straight line with extremes at opposite ends, it pictures the spectrum bending like a horseshoe, bringing the far left and far right surprisingly close.
Close in what way, though? Not in their core beliefs, surely.
Well, that's the key point. Not necessarily in their ideology, but often in their methods, their tactics, and their fundamental rejection of liberal democratic values.
Okay, where did this idea come from?
It's often attributed to a French philosopher, Jean-Pierre Fay. He developed it analyzing 20th century totalitarianism. He looked at historical events like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939.
Ah, between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union?
Exactly. You have Nazism rooted in, racial supremacy and communism in class struggle, fundamentally opposed ideologies. Yet, Fay pointed out these chilling parallels in how they governed.
So, completely different whys, but similar hows. What kind of parallels are we talking about?
We're talking ruthless suppression of any political dissent, vast state surveillance networks, the use of concentration camps, and these really powerful cults of personality built around the leaders Hitler and Stalin.
Wow.
Fay's core insight, really, was that as movements get further from the liberal democratic center, their shared rejection of things like pluralism and individual rights pushes them towards similar authoritarian, totalitarian methods.
So the real battle isn't left versus right, but maybe the center versus the extremes.
That's the reframing the theory proposes. It's the liberal democratic center versus these illiberal authoritarian fringes, regardless of their specific ideology. It's a chilling thought, as you said.
And it's not just historical analysis, right? People use this theory to talk about politics today.
Absolutely. It gets invoked all the time, especially looking at shared anti-establishment stances,
Hmm.
or even anti-capitalist ones, though that gets complicated.
How so?
Well, both extremes often use populist rhetoric, right? It's always the people versus some corrupt elite. They often target globalization, international finance,
But they want different things from that critique, presumably.
completely different things. The far left's anti-capitalism is usually aiming for, say, economic equality, dismantling hierarchies.
Mm.
The far right's is often tied to nationalist protectionism, maybe even xenophobia or anti-Semitism. But their target, the existing system, the establishment, can look very similar.
And we see this convergence in surprising places, like
Yeah.
foreign policy.
Yeah, the Russia-Ukraine war was a really stark example, wasn't it? You had figures on the American far right, someone like Tucker Carlson, echoing talking points that were very favorable to the Kremlin.
Right.
And then on the far left, you had intellectuals, Noam Chomsky, for example, arguing strongly against arming Ukraine, framing U.S. involvement as, Western imperialism.
So totally different reasons, but they landed on the same policy position opposing U.S. support for Ukraine.
Exactly. It's like they found common ground in rejecting the mainstream consensus, even if their underlying motives were poles apart.
And it's not just policy. You mentioned tactics, too.
Yeah, there's a tactical and maybe even a cultural alignment sometimes. Think about the use of intimidation, public shaming, maybe even blacklists of opponents. Both ends of the spectrum have faced accusations of using cancel culture, for example, to shut down debate.
And that shared use of anti-elitism rhetoric to try and delegitimize institutions or media.
Right. It feeds into this profound distrust of authority, which seems to be a common thread. That distrust can fuel conspiracy theories, too, whether it's about, I don't know, 9/11 or vaccine safety or whatever.
It's like a gateway, isn't it? If you already distrust mainstream sources.
It can be. And that leads to some fascinating, if slightly strange, phenomena, like the so-called crunchy to alt-right pipeline.
Explain that one. Crunchy.
Yeah, crunchy as in like progressive alternative wellness communities, people very focused on natural health, maybe homeschooling, often skeptical of mainstream medicine or government regulation. Because they already have this deep-seated rejection of mainstream authority, some researchers suggest they can become, perhaps surprisingly, susceptible to far-right ideologies that also position themselves as anti-establishment and anti-elite. It shows how that anti-authority stance, even if it starts from a seemingly left-leaning place, can potentially open a door to something very different.
Interesting. But you said earlier the theory is really contested. Academics push back on it.
Oh, heavily. Many dismiss it as a massive oversimplification. They argue it ignores fundamental, irreconcilable differences between the far left and the far right.
So this gets to that why versus what critique you mentioned from Corey Doctorow.
Exactly that. Dr. O and others argue the theory confuses superficial similarities in tactics, the what they do with fundamental differences in beliefs and goals, the why they do it, and what they ultimately want.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. Think about critiques of, say, the New Deal in the U.S. Both extremes might criticize it. But the left critique is typically that it didn't go far enough, it excluded certain groups, it didn't fundamentally challenge capitalism enough.
Whereas the right critique is
That it shouldn't have existed at all, that it was an illegitimate overreach of government power. Their desired outcomes are diametrically opposed. One wants more intervention of a certain kind, the other wants none.
Okay, that makes sense. And their anti-capitalism differs fundamentally too, you said.
Absolutely. Far-left anti-capitalism tends to be universalist, focused on class, aiming for an egalitarian society. Far-right anti-capitalism is often nationalist, sometimes explicitly anti-Semitic, targeting globalist finance,
Yeah.
aiming to impose or preserve a very different kind of social hierarchy. They might hate the same system, but the worlds they want to build are mutually exclusive.
So if horseshoe theory is flawed ideologically, does it offer any useful insight? What should we take away from it?
Well, that's the interesting part. While it might be a poor descriptor of ideology, it might point towards something else, maybe a psychological or temperamental alignment.
Temperamental, how so?
Some recent research suggests what they call an asymmetric U-shaped relationship. It found that individuals at both extremes, far left and far right, show a greater propensity for things like collective action and also report higher levels of anger.
So it's not about shared political goals, but maybe shared personality traits.
Perhaps. Things like a shared intensity, a strong emotional response to what they see as injustice, maybe a lower tolerance for compromise, a greater willingness to use radical tactics to achieve their very different ends. It's less a meeting of philosophies, maybe, and more a convergence of certain psychological profiles and tactical approaches.
Okay, so that's the potential assault from the outside, from the fringes, driven by this shared intensity, even if their goals differ. What about the other side of the pincer? What's happening inside the system that makes it vulnerable? That brings us to the UniParty thesis.
Right. And this is a really potent populist critique. The core assertion is that the major parties, say Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. or similar pairings elsewhere, are basically two wings of the same bird. Meaning that despite all the public fighting and the culture war stuff, they're actually pursuing unified goals that benefit some kind of ruling elite. The public disagreements are just, political theater, designed to keep the rest of us divided, while the real agenda moves forward behind the scenes.
That taps into a real feeling of powerlessness, doesn't it? That sense that your vote doesn't really change the fundamentals.
It absolutely does. And it's not a new idea, even if it feels very current. The term UniParty apparently dates back to 1944.
Wow.
But it really got traction, at least in recent memory, with the left-wing populist Ralph Nader back in 2000. He talked about the corporate UniParty, arguing both major U.S. parties were essentially captured by the same corporate interests.
But then it got picked up by the other side.
Right. Fascinatingly, yes. In the 2010s, figures on the populist right, people like Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, even Robert F. Kennedy Jr., more recently, they resurrected and repurposed the term. They use it to attack what they call the Washington establishment, the swamp, the deep state.
So it's a label used by both left and right populists against the perceived center, often linked to deep state ideas, you said.
Yeah, there's often an overlap in the rhetoric. It speaks to that same sense of a hidden, unaccountable power structure.
Okay, so that's the populist framing. How do political scientists approach this? Do they buy into a secret uniparty colluding behind closed doors?
Not usually in that conspiratorial way,
Hmm.
but they have identified real structural changes, a kind of decay happening within mainstream parties that helps explain why that uniparty critique resonates so much.
What kind of decay?
Well, one influential model is the cartel party theory, developed by Peter Mayer and Richard Katz. They argued that major parties in established democracies started acting less like competitors representing distinct voter groups
Mhm.
and more like, well, a cartel.
A cartel, like colluding businesses.
In a sense, yes, colluding to limit genuine political competition and share the spoils of state power amongst themselves. One way they do this, the theory suggests, is by increasingly delegating important decisions away from elected politicians
To who?
to technocratic bodies, things like independent central banks, constitutional courts, maybe even supranational bodies like the European Union, bodies that are deliberately insulated from direct electoral pressure.
So they push power to unelected experts, which makes elections feel less decisive, less meaningful for voters.
That's the argument. It creates a political class that's more focused on managing the system, managing crises, rather than enacting bold changes based on voter mandates. It reduces the perceived impact of voting.
And there's another related idea, particularly in the U.S. context, the hollow party.
Right, that's from Daniel Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld. They argue that even as American parties became more polarized ideologically on the surface, their internal structures, their organizational muscle, actually atrophied. They became hollow shells.
Hollow how? What functions did they lose?
Core functions that parties use to perform themselves. Things like mobilizing voters, raising money, developing detailed policy, even recruiting candidates. These have increasingly been outsourced
Outsourced to who?
to what Schlossman and Rosenfeld call the party blob. This constellation of external groups, think tanks, super PACs, big donors, single-issue activist groups, consultants.
Yeah. So the party brand is strong, but the actual organization is weak, dependent on these outside players.
Exactly. And the consequences are huge. The parties become more like vessels for these outside interests, rather than authentic, bottom-up representatives of their members or voters.
Which makes them seem unresponsive.
Unresponsive, ineffective, and crucially, vulnerable. Weak, hollowed-out parties are much easier for extremist factions or charismatic outsiders to capture. We saw a version of that, arguably, with Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party machinery.
So the weakness, the hollowing out, creates the distrust.
That's the critical link. The populist UniParty theory, that feeling that the parties are secretly the same, is really a symptom of this deeper structural decay.
How does that work? What's the chain reaction?
Well, the hollowing and cartelization shift real power away from ordinary voters and towards a narrower elite party leaders, donors, technocrats. This naturally leads to policies and priorities that feel unresponsive to the wider public.
And voters see this. They notice the bipartisan consensus on certain issues, maybe like big spending bills or foreign surveillance or interventionist foreign policy.
Right. And they see the gridlock, the lack of progress on major problems. They perceive this unresponsiveness and they interpret it, understandably perhaps, as evidence that the parties are colluding, that it is a uniparty serving some other interest.
Which creates this destructive cycle we talked about earlier.
Precisely. The hollowing creates distrust and a vacuum. That vacuum fuels the rise of anti-establishment populists who campaign against the corrupt uniparty.
And if those populists get power, they might not actually fix the underlying problem.
They might even make it worse. Sometimes they further weaken the very party structures they took over, as arguably happened with the Republican Party under Trump. This deepens the institutional decay, which reinforces the public's perception of a failed system, making the next anti-establishment wave seem even more appealing.
So the weakening center and the energized fringes just keep feeding each other, spiraling downwards.
Exactly. It's a mutually reinforcing cycle of decay and distrust.
Okay, so let's pull back the curtain then. We have this assault from the extremes, tactically converging perhaps, and this decay from the center, this hollowing out. Where does it lead? What's the convergence point when these two blades meet?
The convergence point, the devastating outcome, is what we're calling a hollowed-out democracy. Political scientists often use terms like democratic backsliding or autocratization.
Backsliding sounds gradual.
It often is, and that's the insidious part. It's usually not a sudden military coup. It's more often a slow, methodical erosion from within, frequently led by elected leaders using the tools of the state.
Using the law against itself, in a way.
Exactly. They use legislation, executive orders, control over appointments, often incrementally, to dismantle the checks and balances that are supposed to hold them accountable. It's so subtle sometimes you don't realize the cumulative damage until it's quite far gone.
And it attacks democracy on multiple fronts. You mentioned three pillars of accountability.
Right. First, it targets horizontal accountability. Those are the checks and balances between different branches of government. So think about weakening the judiciary, packing courts, sidelining independent civil servants, concentrating power of the executive branch. That's sometimes called executive aggrandizement.
Okay, so weakening the internal checks. What's next?
Second, it undermines vertical accountability. That's the crucial link between the citizens and the government. Primarily, this means subverting free and fair elections. Tactics like gerrymandering electoral districts, passing restrictive voter ID laws, making it harder to register or vote, spreading disinformation to confuse voters or discredit results. Anything that weakens the power of the ballot box.
And the third pillar.
Diagonal accountability. This refers to the accountability imposed by independent actors outside the formal state structure, mainly a free press and a vibrant civil society.
So attacking the media, restricting NGOs.
Precisely. Passing laws to curb media freedom, harassing or prosecuting critical journalists, imposing burdensome regulations on non-governmental organizations, intimidating activists, silencing the watchdogs.
And because it happens piece by piece, often using legal means, it's hard to fight back. It's like a constitutional coup.
That's a good way to put it. Each step, a new media law, a change to judicial appointments, can be defended as legitimate on its own terms. It's the cumulative effect that hollows out the democracy. Countries like Hungary or Turkey or Venezuela are often held up as examples where the forms of democracy, elections, parliament might still exist, but the substance, the real accountability and competition has been gutted. They're hollow shells.
So let's put it all together now. How do the horseshoe dynamics, the extremes, and the UniParty hollowing dynamic, the center, work together as these two blades driving this backsliding?
Okay, so path one is the direct assault from the extremes. This is where the horseshoe theory's insights, particularly about tactical convergence and shared anti-establishment fervor, come into play.
They actively attack the system.
Yes, they explicitly target the legitimacy of democratic institutions and norms. Their rhetoric normalizes anti-democratic behavior. They reject core liberal values like pluralism, rule of law, minority rights. It's an active force trying to tear things down.
Okay, that's the assault. Path two is the decay from the center.
Right. This is the uniparty hollow party dynamic. It's the enabling decay, the structural weakening of mainstream parties, their unresponsiveness, the sense of elite collusion. Yeah. This creates the vulnerability.
How does it enable the assault?
It fosters voter alienation, cynicism, apathy. When people lose faith in the mainstream, when they feel the system is rigged and doesn't serve them, they become susceptible.
Susceptible to the promises of the extremists.
Exactly. They become susceptible to the populist demagogues who promise to smash the corrupt establishment. The failure of the center to govern effectively, to maintain trust, creates the political vacuum that the fringes rush into. The hollow center simply can't hold against that energized assault.
It really is synergistic then. The decay creates the demand for the extremism.
And the extremism further destabilizes and weakens the center, accelerating the whole decline. They feed off each other.
If we quickly compare them, Horseshoe is about the radicals, the populists on the edges. Motivated by transformation, using mobilization and rhetoric, energizing the alienated, directly attacking.
Whereas uniparty hollowing is more about the mainstream leadership, the elites. Motivated perhaps by power consolidation or just managing the status quo, using consensus, delegation, maybe legislative collusion, fostering cynicism and apathy, indirectly eroding by creating weakness.
And this whole toxic environment, it really hits younger generations hard, doesn't it?
Acutely. There was that landmark study from the University of Cambridge. Really striking findings. It showed millennials are the first generation in living memory to have a global majority who are dissatisfied with the way democracy works.
A global majority. How high was the figure?
Around 55% dissatisfaction by their mid-30s, And interestingly, for both millennials and Gen X, that dissatisfaction level actually decreases as they get older within those generations, which challenges the old idea that people just get more conservative or content with age. It suggests something deeper is going on.
Almost like they're inheriting a system they fundamentally feel doesn't work for them from the start.
And a big part of that seems to be economic exclusion. Younger generations are grappling with huge student debt, the near impossibility of homeownership in many places, massive wealth inequality compared to previous generations.
And they blame the system for that. The establishment,
Yeah.
the perceived UniParty.
Often, yes. That feeling that the system is rigged economically is frequently tied back to the policy consensus, sometimes called neoliberalism, that dominated the mainstream parties for decades. This economic anxiety fuels political alienation. It makes younger people, understandably, more open to leaders who promise radical change, even autocratic ones. And their trust in government is, frankly, abysmal in many countries.
This often gets dismissed as just youth apathy, doesn't it? Like they just don't care.
Yeah, but maybe apathy's a wrong word, or at least too simplistic.
How so?
Well, is it always just laziness or indifference?
Yeah.
Or can apathy actually be a, well, a irrational, if maybe corrosive response to a system that feels dysfunctional?
Meaning, if you feel the system doesn't listen, doesn't work for you, that your participation is futile, maybe withdrawing is a logical response?
It could be. It might stem from deep alienation or just sheer voter fatigue from the constant political noise or the feeling that you're always choosing the lesser of two evils between unresponsive parties. When people perceive the mainstream as a corrupt duopoly, checking out might feel like the only sane option, not necessarily a failure of civic character.
That connects to some really foundational ideas about democracy, doesn't it? It's not a machine that runs itself.
Not at all. Thinkers going way back, Plato, Rousseau, Locke, John Stuart Mill, they all stressed in different ways that democracy requires a certain kind of citizen, a virtuous, engaged citizenry. Mill even saw participation itself as educational, as building character.
So it's like an ongoing project, something passed down.
Exactly. You could frame democracy as an intergenerational project. Each generation doesn't just inherit rights and freedoms. They inherit the responsibility to maintain, repair, and maybe even improve the democratic infrastructure for those who come after.
Which includes the institutions, the norms of debate, rule
Yeah.
of law.
All of it. And if you look at it that way, our current problems of polarization, the decay, could be seen as a crisis of that civic virtue, a breakdown in that intergenerational contract.
Undermined by things like media polarization, the decline of local communities or unions, what some call a culture of contempt.
Right. All these things erode the virtues democracy depends on, like tolerance, compromise, reasoned debate. And when the system itself seems corrupt or unresponsive, the incentive for individuals to be that virtuous, engaged citizen, well, it weakens, doesn't it?
Which leads to a really critical, maybe even heartbreaking question, this disillusionment we see, especially among younger generations. Is it a failure on their part, a kind of apathetic complacency, maybe not appreciating the struggles that won the freedoms they have?
Or is it a perfectly rational, even justified response to being handed a system that feels hollowed out, dysfunctional, and just doesn't seem to address their urgent concerns about the economy, the climate, their future?
What does the evidence suggest?
Honestly, it looks like a tragic and really complex mix of both. Perhaps there's a diminished historical consciousness in some ways, but that's compounded by a very real, very rational alienation from a political system that increasingly looks broken, unresponsive, and whose promises ring hollow for many.
Okay, so let's try to recap this deep dive. We've explored this idea of a pincer movement squeezing liberal democracy.
Right. On one side, you've got the direct assault from the extremes. We look at that through the lens of the Horseshoe Theory, maybe not an ideological convergence, but a convergence of tactics, of temperament, of anti-establishment energy aimed at tearing down the status quo.
And on the other side, the second blade is that enabling decay from the center. The UniParty critique, refined by academic ideas like Cartel and hollow parties, pointing to the structural rot, the unresponsiveness, the vulnerability within mainstream institutions.
And this vulnerability, this decay, fosters the public alienation that the extremists then feed on.
The ultimate convergence point, where these two forces meet, is this state of hollowed-out democracy. The institutions might still stand, the elections might still happen, but they're stripped of their substance, their accountability, their public trust.
And that feels like the perilous state many democracies are in or heading towards today.
So if that's the diagnosis, what about the path forward, the path to renewal? It sounds like it has to be a two-front effort, too.
It seems that way. On one front, you need a really robust, unapologetic defense of core liberal democratic norms, free speech, rule of law, minority rights, political pluralism against those direct attacks from the extremes, standing firm on the principles.
But that's not enough on its own, is it, if the center is hollow?
Exactly. So the second front, maybe the harder and more fundamental one, is the deep structural revitalization of those core political institutions, rebuilding parties so they're actually responsive and rooted, reforming campaign finance to curb unaccountable money, fostering a civic culture that values deliberation and compromise over just shouting and demagoguery.
That is a monumental task.
It absolutely is. And it
Yeah.
falls, doesn't it? Especially heavily on the inheriting generations. The challenge isn't just to lecture younger people about their civic duty.
It's about actually fixing the broken machine.
Yes. It's about undertaking the hard, unglamorous work of repairing the very structures of democracy itself so that participation feels meaningful again, so that trust can be rebuilt.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. Reflecting on all this, what steps could you potentially take, even small ones, in your own community, in your own life, to engage with and help rebuild those structures, to help make democracy feel truly substantive again?